Take 3. I've already deleted 2 false starts on this thing, so allergies. Maybe I can get it right this time. We're continuing with long-term background issues of the revolution. We've looked at 3 issues that grew out of the mercantile system. 2 of them, well, all 3. Check those out in the supplements. The 4th one is not as directly related to mercantilism. It seems that there were a number of wars involving the colonists. These were serious, nasty wars in which people living along the northern frontier were punished more terribly than any Americans have ever suffered in any war, with the possible exception of some aspects of the Revolutionary War and the Civil War. And they wouldn't even have heard about these wars if they had not been part of the British Empire. In fact, our end of those wars would not have happened. So, I'll refer you to a map on page 92 of your regular textbook, U.S. Narrative History. That only pertains to the last of the wars, but you need to kind of see the lay of the land. You know where the British 13 colonies were, became 13 as of the early 1730s. North of that, in what's now southeastern Canada, an area known as Quebec, the French had a colony. There were nowhere near as many people as in the English colonies, but there they were. And at the end of the 1600s, the French and the British, who'd been fighting each other time and again down through the centuries, they entered this lengthy phase where they're at war a lot. Between 1689 and 1815, that's 126 years, England and France were at war almost half the time. 6 long, major wars. 4 of them happened during the colonial period. We were dragged into every one of them. In fact, we started 2 of them. Let that be said. So we'll just look at them real quick and not waste a whole lot of time. The first of these was, it lasted from 1689 to 1697. The colonists called it King William's War, after the King William III. In Europe, it was known as, and this will mean nothing to you, very little to me, the War of the League of Augsburg, 1689 to 1697. There's some commonalities of all these wars I'll come back to. That one was hardly over when another one started. It lasted from 1702 to 1713. That's a really long war. It was known in the colonies as Queen Anne's War. That took up most of her reign, almost all of it. In Europe, it was known as the War of the Spanish Succession. Both these first 2 were fought to redress what they used to call the balance of power. In Europe, wars were not national wars, they were dynastic wars. Their purpose being to make sure no one country got to be too powerful. If one kingdom looks like it's getting too powerful, the others will gang up and just cut it down to size. So, after Queen Anne's War was over, we got the longest period of peace in this entire blood-soaked epoch, from 1713 to 1740. In the late 1730s, a tiff broke out between England and Spain known as the War of Jenkins's Ear. There's a story behind that. Fortunately, I don't know what it is, or I might be tempted to tell you. It lasted from 1740 to 1748. So what those 3 wars all have in common, by the way, it was known in Europe as the War of the Austrian Succession. What those wars have in common is that they began in Europe and spilled over into America, because whenever Britain and France went to war with each other in Europe, their colonists went to war with each other in America. And as I say, these are serious. In all 3 of these wars, the French would send their numerous and powerful Indian allies to attack settlements up and down the northern colonial frontier. And there's butchery. It was ruthless. It was a horrific kind of war. The colonists, through their militia units, fought back as best they could. Meanwhile, the colonists themselves carried out large-scale military exercises capturing various French strong points. I think I forgot, I didn't review this. It's in the supplements. An island off the mouth of the St. Lawrence River called Port Royal. The colonists captured that in the First War in the late 1600s. We're proud of ourselves. We're pulling our weight. We're showing we're grown-ups here. Peace negotiations, the Brits gave it back. That's our reward. In Queen Anne's War, they captured it again. That time the Brits had the decency to, I think, maybe blow it up. I don't know, something like that. In King George's War, which is what we call the War of the Austrian Succession, the one in the 1740s, British government's trying to fight this war without spending too much money. Turned out the way wars turn out when you do that. Their most notable victory was won by colonists who captured a supposedly uncapturable French fort called Louisbourg at the mouth of the St. Lawrence River. So these were major serious wars. So the Revolution was not the first or even the second time Americans had marched off to war. So, but the British seemed to be very snooty about all this. They'd give back things we captured, take our participation for granted, that sort of thing. People don't forget that kind of thing. The fourth of these wars is by far the most important and is regarded by historians as the most significant European war of the entire 18th century, our own revolution notwithstanding. It was known in Europe as the 7 Years' War. It's known in America as the French and Indian War. And the way it started set it apart from the first 3 of the imperial wars. Specifically, it began in what is now western Pennsylvania, where 2 rivers come together. Unless you're from up there, you haven't heard of the rivers. The Allegheny and the Monongahela meet and form the Ohio. No settlement there at the time. That place was known at the time as the Forks of the Ohio. Well, here are the French leaders sitting up there in Quebec, and there are no more than about 100,000 French settlers at a time when the population of the English colonies was sailing past 2.5 million with all sails set. The English are being restrained from moving further west by a natural obstacle. The Appalachian Mountains run sort of southwest to northeast, where the western, as far west as the colonists could go. Beyond that, the Indians, who mostly were allied with the French, they're powerful, they're hostile. Just couldn't go out there. Well, the French don't need a crystal ball to tell them that one of these days the English are going to start spilling through those mountain passes in numbers too big to stop, and there won't be anything to stop them until they get to the Pacific. You could see that coming. You didn't have to be a Nobel Prize winner to see that. So the French they claimed the entire middle third of what's now the United States, continental United States. The entire area drained by the Mississippi River system. That's enormous. But they don't have anybody out there. The Indians are generally friendly, but they are not. They're loyal to themselves. I mean, yeah, wouldn't they be? There were a few French fur trappers and traders and people like that. That's not a population on the ground. So, in the early 1750s, the French began building forts to stabilize their control of the area, make sure they maintain control of the very lucrative fur trade, that kind of thing. So the forts that they built eventually passed to the English and became sites of major cities. There was a fort, forget the name of it, it's where Buffalo, New York stands today. There was one where Cleveland stands today, one where Detroit, I think that's the name they gave it, and Chicago, Fort Dearborn, I think. And they built a fort at the Forks of the Ohio. It's just a log palisades, all it is, French soldiers. They named it Fort Duquesne. If you were taking notes, and I know you're not, but if you were, that would be spelled Duquesne. Why can't these people learn to spell? Well, News of this reached the ears of the royal governor of Virginia. I believe that was Lord Dunmore, but I'm not 100% sure. Gotta check this out. That was land claimed by both Virginia and Pennsylvania. And so the governor sent a small expedition out to check this out and see if the fort was really there. In charge of this expedition was a 21-year-old surveyor named George Washington. Yep, same guy. Well, he's an experienced frontiersman already, but he makes some rookie mistakes. Um, like letting some Indians talk him into attacking a camp where some Frenchmen were camping out, and this high-ranking French nobleman was there, and the Indians killed him. But the blood's kind of on our hands. Turns out he was on a diplomatic mission, which means under the rules, and they were sticklers for the rules in those days, supposed to be untouchable. Well, Washington and his men were captured by the French, and but they were released to go back and inform the royal governor that, yep, the French are there, and nope, they ain't leaving. Okay. Washington wrote up a report of this, which was published all over America and all over Europe, and his name starts to become a household word when he's not hardly any older than you guys. Okay, the governor sent him back the next year. We're looking at 1754, I think. Sent him back out there in command of around 150 Virginia militiamen. Militia were, I would say they're like the National Guard, but I don't want to insult the National Guard. These are voluntary amateur soldiers. So Washington gets out there and finds that the younger brother of the guy that got killed on his first expedition is out there too, with around 1,500 French soldiers. Washington and his men cut down as many trees as they can and build a log fort they called Fort Necessity. Well named. Now, prudence would dictate that if you're making a clearing, your perimeter should be farther than a musket will shoot. I guess they didn't have time. Captured again. Washington bears the news back. So he's not exactly covering himself with glory here, but he's pretty good at writing it up. Then the British got serious, sending over an army of around 900 full-time, full-trained professional soldiers. I'm going to introduce a word here so you know what I mean when I say it. Full-time active duty professional soldiers are called regulars. Okay? Part-timers with very little training or discipline are called militia. Okay? Anyway, so you get around 900 British redcoats commanded by an experienced general named Edward Braddock and augmented by around 2,500 Virginia militiamen. So we're talking about over 3,000 men here. And they're going to dislodge the French from Fort Duquesne. Didn't quite work out. Braddock and his men got out there, and they didn't make it to Fort Duquesne. They were waylaid by Indians, of whom the British were terrified. The Indians were so cowardly and unmanly, they would fire from behind cover, and there really wasn't enough room out there for the British to line up and deploy the tactics in which they've been trained. So this came close to being a complete annihilation. Braddock himself was killed. In fact, only two officers in the British American force were not at least wounded. One of those two was George Washington, again just in his early 20s. Washington basically took over and got the retreat organized so that some of them at least would survive. He had bullet holes in his coat, had hats shot off, he had 2 horses shot out from under him, nary a scratch. In fact, that's his whole military career. He was never a rear echelon commander. He was always out front and never a scratch. Surely he's not the only soldier who could say that, but his high-profile position have caused some people to try to make quite a bit out of that. The other officer was a British captain named Thomas Gage, and we'll hear about him about 20 years later. He will recur in our story. By that time, he's been promoted a few times and will be the commanding general of all British forces in North America for a little while.